Hello, and welcome to Australia in Focus, the podcast where Australian and international doers, thinkers, and changemakers dive into the issues shaping Australia. I'm Danny Hunter, founder and principal of Hunter Collective, and your host of Australia in Focus. In each episode, we'll explore the complex challenges, innovative solutions, and transformative ideas driving our nation forward. By diving deep into the here and now and looking ahead at what's possible, Australia in Focus is bringing you the conversations that matter, the conversations that illuminate the path to Australia's future. A warm welcome to Australia in Focus. I'm Danny Hunter, your host, and today I am delighted to welcome our first international guest, Greg Clark, who's going to talk with us today about Australia's urban future. Welcome, Greg. Welcome to Australia in Focus.
Danny, it's lovely to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
My pleasure. And all the way across time zones and countries, we are talking today from the UK and obviously here in Australia. So, Greg, let me tell everyone a little bit about you. You're an international urbanist, author, chairperson and advocate for city leaders and urban investors as well. You've got this wonderful cross-section of public and private sector experience, having worked with over 400 cities worldwide. So you certainly know what's going on in the world and you've written all about it. You're the author of 10 books and over 100 reports. You must never get writer's block, I can imagine, with all of that knowledge and intelligence flowing out of you. And you hold also numerous global leadership positions, having been in that career a very regular visitor to Australia. You are passionate and you have a fascination with place leadership, innovation, investment, the built environment, mobility systems, urban assets, and city sustainability. And if we get to even just a few of those topics today, we'll be doing really well as we talk with you about Australia's urban future. So, Greg, let's kick off. Let's just get straight into it. When you think about Australia, what comes to mind?
Danny, I thought about this question because you kindly sent it to me in advance. And I thought actually 3 things come to mind when I think about Australia. Thing number 1 is a timeline. I think of the 250,000 years that humankind has been evolving for, the 60,000 years of continuous settlement on the massive island that is Australia. I think of the 250 years since British colonialisation began in Australia, and then the 150 years of the Irish, the Lebanese, the Italian, the 125 years of the Greeks, the 100 years of the Serbian populations, and so many more. And I think of Australia as this kind of place of layered societies that have evolved over a lot of time. So a timeline, a lifestyle comes to mind as well, a combination of the freedom of people who live in a very big country with, for much of history, a blessed climate and the opportunity to live on the land but near the water, and the lifestyle that comes from that, the outdoors nature of Australian life, the sense of breathing clean air and the sense of having a lot of space to occupy and the sense of freedom that brings. And then the third thing I think of is the character of the people, a tenacious, open-minded, generally very gracious and generous people, highly competitive, focused and determined, and generally very hard-working and sort of diligent people who really want to make the most of life's opportunities, especially if their heritage harks back to a population that was displaced for some reason. And so my sense of respect and joy every time I meet Australians or I go to Australia is unbounded.
We should all feel very flattered by that analysis that you've given us, Greg. And we certainly are, in so many respects, such a lucky country. And one of the things that's really driven Australia and Australia's economy over time has, I guess, in my perspective, been the way we've been able to reinvent ourselves. And you talk a lot about the reinvention of cities, particularly in the post-pandemic era. Tell us what that looks like globally. What should we be thinking about here in Australia that you can see internationally?
Yes, well, I think, Danny, we need to put it in a bigger context, which is that my reading of history tells us that we've been, around for 250,000 years as a species, and for something like 6.5 to 7,000 years, we've been building cities, depending upon your definition of the first city. And that urbanization process has been trickling along, and industrialization created a big acceleration. But another big acceleration has happened, and this time it's a kind of existential and exponential acceleration. On the one hand, it's associated with the Anthropocene. That's the thing that makes it existential. And on the other hand, it's associated with the rise of a whole new series of technologies, and that's the thing that makes it exponential. So I pay a lot of attention to the century that began in 1980 and will end in 2080. I call this the century of cities. This is the century in which human population moves from being roughly 40% living in cities and towns to roughly 80% living in cities and towns, roughly 2.3 billion people in cities and towns to roughly 9.2 billion people living in cities and towns, and roughly 275 cities of 1 million people to 1,600 cities of 1 million people. So we multiply the percentage by 2, we multiply the number of people living in cities by 4, and we multiply the number of cities over 1 million by 6 in this simple century, which we're just approaching the middle of right now. Now, the fact that we had a pandemic sort of 40 years into this 100-year period is a very interesting thing, because it's been a driver and accelerator of change. And I think the most simple way to think about this is that the pandemic induced a series of accelerations in the way we use technology in particular, but also our ideas about public space, personal space, shared environments. It induced some changes in our behaviors towards each other and the role of governments in our lives. And essentially, what I think the pandemic will prove to have been was to have a kind of sorting effect for cities. And basically what it says is that the old modality of, because people have to live somewhere and work somewhere else, we try to place near the locations where they work things like shops and retail and other things. And in the places where they live, we've tended to just provide what we might call residential amenities. That thing has got shaken up. And the shaking up really means that city centres and our sort of urbanized areas need to focus much more on not just the, as it were, the efficiency of office buildings and retail parks and other kinds of amenities, but they need to focus much more on the experience of those things, making them really great. They need to focus much more on how they drive innovation rather than how they host routine activities. And they need to think of themselves not just of places of work, but of places of habitat as well. So to put this really simply, cities have to reinvent themselves around doing the things that need to be done face-to-face and face-to-place, because the acceleration in digital technologies has allowed us to take so many other things online or to have them closer to where people live. So there's a big transition going on, Danny, and this is happening in most of the developed cities of the world. Let's just say very quickly that in Australasia, in North America, and in Europe, this is a process of re-equipping our cities for the new hybrid lifestyles. It's about redeveloping city centres so that they offer more amenities, more opportunities for people to live downtown, more of a focus on innovation-led economic activity and less on simply providing services in a remote way. It means that our suburbs are becoming more dense as people want to work near to where they live, and more amenities are required there. And it means that we're having to think much more about the experience of the journey from place of sleep to place of work, and making that journey on which as an experience is more rewarding. so that people are not simply stuck in very long commutes and all of that. So in North America, in Australasia, and in Europe, that's the story. In Latin America, following the pandemic, people came back to the city very quickly. And in many cases, they didn't leave the city. And that's partly because of the sector mix in Latin American urban economies. More people had to go to work, but partly because going to the workplace in Latin America is part of the social capital of the society there, and people really enjoy that. In the Middle East, in India and in China, COVID has had very little impact on urbanization processes, and the city centers didn't become denuded of their workforces and didn't lose the amenities that went with that. So for them, the big issue is really about accommodating very rapid population growth, which I know we'll come back to soon. And in Africa, the process of urbanization is not one that's particularly driven by economic activity, although urbanization itself is driving economic activity, not the other way around. So for our countries in Australasia, in Europe, and in North America, we're on a journey to reinvent our cities for the post-pandemic world, using the big accelerations that happened as a sorting effect to get us to reallocate the right kinds of things to our cities and the right kinds of things to our suburbs. And it's a process that requires huge ingenuity, it requires leadership, it requires collaboration, and it's going to last for another decade at least.
How much bring forward do you think there was because of the pandemic? Do you think we would have gotten to where we're headed? I mean, obviously not nearly as quickly, but do you think we would have gotten there in the next decade or so anyway?
For sure, yes, I think we would.
Yeah.
So if you want to think of it this way, we were already all participating in remote working, and there was already, where it was possible, a bit of a work from home sort of ethic emerging, and people saying, well, you know, I'll come into the office when I need to, I'll work from home when I need to. That was accelerated. We were already doing a lot of our retail online and getting the weekly shop delivered, or choosing the items we particularly wanted from a vast range of different things online. And there was a little bit of experience-based retail emerging, in the sense of, you know, look at it online, try it in store, and all of that kind of thing. We were already receiving government services, and you know, there was the growth of remote medicine and distance learning and all of those other things. So we were already starting to differentiate the things we can do online, as it were, face to space, from the things that we needed to do face to face and face to place. But I think this just accelerated all of that. And of course, the challenge with that is that the accelerated change can be experienced as a shock, for example, in those who own office buildings and towers, or a shock for those who own shopping malls in the downtowns, or a shock for those who, whose role is to provide transport services for commuters or for corporates or consumers. So all of those aspects of our lives have been shaken by the shock, and they're having to reinvent their business models. And I know this from very first-hand experience. As a member of the Board of Transport for London, we've been gradually recovering our ridership, and we're back up to 91% of pre-pandemic levels on the London public transport system. But the reasons that people are travelling from outside of London into the centre of London have changed, and there's a much stronger focus on leisure, tourism, entertainment, bigger concentrations of activity on Thursday nights rather than Friday nights. You know, Fridays are still a quiet day in the office in London. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday are back to almost where they were before. So every city and every nation is adjusting to these changes in different ways, and it's requiring us to be inventive, right? And that's a good thing. It's just that the speed of the reinvention required is more than we might have anticipated.
Well, that's right. And what you said about that sort of midweek peak and then different reasons to come into the city from Friday to Sunday is certainly playing out here in Australia's capital cities, particularly Sydney and Melbourne. We're seeing that a lot. I want to touch on, you raised it earlier, population growth and the drive of population growth that's so present in cities globally. In Australia, the debate is very, very hot and heavy right now around how much is too much, skills-based migration, international students. The links are often drawn, particularly in media, between high levels of population growth and then housing crisis and congestion pressures faced by Australians. Is this a common thread that you're seeing in cities around the world? And how is the narrative and the discussion, the community engagement with that discussion playing out, perhaps in one or two examples you've seen?
Well, this is the big issue of our current decade, Danny, and it's difficult to talk about this without, getting into the numbers a little bit more. So let's just focus down a bit and say, look, the issue here is that as a human species, we're living on one planet. That planet is finite in the resources and the land space that it has. But the human population is growing exponentially. And because of that, migration and migratory patterns and people leaving one environment to come to another environment is increasing all of the time. That's the first thing to say. The idea that, 70 million people in the United Kingdom or 120 million people in Turkey can say that this land is our land and we want to defend our borders against other people is a little bit of a last century idea. And I think that the idea that we use migration policies to control the population that we have and we keep our land and our resources to itself is very fixed in ideas about nation states that may not stand the test of time. That's the first thing I want to say. The second thing to say, of course, is that population growth is generally an indicator of success. People want to move to cities, to regions, and to nations where they think the life chances that they will have there are greater than the places that they're leaving. And of course, migration happens for a number of reasons. There are push factors as well as pull factors. But if you're in the business of wanting to be a successful nation, then you have to accept, I think, that people will want to move to your nation. Now, this is a kind of normal aspect of contemporary life everywhere. And Australian cities have been communicating, I think, to the outside world for quite a long period of time that they have this magical combination of that lifestyle that I described right at the beginning, that character of the Australian people that's so attractive, and alluring that I described at the beginning, and at the same time, an economy that has been in a very, very long boom. So there's absolutely no surprise that people want to come and live in Australia. So in my way of thinking about this, the difference is not between whether you get population growth or not, but how prepared you are to manage and accommodate it. So cities that recognize that population growth is an indicator of success, let's take our friends in Singapore and Dubai just as an example, both of those cities prepare studiously for population growth. They continue to build the capacity of their transport systems. They continue to invest in producing more housing. They continue to invest in the social infrastructure of schools and clinics and hospitals and libraries and swimming pools and leisure centers and all of those urban amenities that make urban life livable. And they use planning, not just land use zoning, but strategic planning to create new districts, new neighborhoods, densified locations, etc. So the difference is whether you find population growth a surprise that you want to somehow resist, or whether you recognize it's a consequence of being a successful and attractive country and therefore plan for it. Now, my sense from my many visits to Australia over many years is that there are two instincts going on in Australia all of the time. Instinct number one is the one you just described. How much is too much? Is migration and international students making our housing crisis worse? The other instinct is to say, we've always been an open country. We are that lucky country. If we bring in highly skilled, highly talented young people from all over the world, we're only going to become more successful. Let's plan for this growth and let's provide the housing, the transport, the amenities, and all of the social infrastructure that are required to make this work. The problem is that one needs to do that on a consistent basis over a long period of time for those policies to actually work. Otherwise, if you have a stop-start approach, to this kind of managing the fruits of success by enlarging the population, it becomes very challenging. I read the Australian Treasury report, the intergenerational report, that said 40 million Australians by 2060 or sooner. I think those numbers are right, and I think it will be sooner than 2060. So the question for Australia is, if that's what your population will be at 2060, how are you planning for that now? And how are you going to create the environment in which those 40 million people can have an even better quality of life from the one they've enjoyed historically?
And there's political capital in that, but there's also tension within the economy. And as the economy appears to be a lot more constrained, there's certainly a lot of political capital that gets used up in making the argument for longer term investment in major projects when, cost of living here is such an issue and government budgets are so tight. But I guess that economic transition that Australia's made over a period of time from being very resource reliant, commodities-based economy, we've moved largely to more of a services and knowledge economy. Has this changed the way that urbanisation appears or is in Australia, that transition of our economy from one output to largely a very different people-based output?
Yes, well, I think that's the underlying trend in Australia's big cycles of change, Danny. And if we just put this very simply, the spatial form that supports the commodities economy is one much more of regional towns that are able to be the kind of functional centres of that commodities economy, combined with effective ports and gateways and logistics and cargo operations. So port cities become very important. And that commodities economy needs multiple routes to move goods from one part of the country to another in order to trade in them. And, I think everybody implicitly understands that the way that Australia evolved over the 100 years up to about 1980 was one of becoming a hugely productive, very efficient commodities economy. And that's still going on, of course. The commodities economy is still alive and well in Australia. It's just much less employment intensive now because of the rise in technology. And at the same time, because of Australia's leadership in technology, research, medicine, sciences, arts, creative industries, cultural industries, professional services, corporate headquarters, finance, and all the rest of it, you've also got a services economy and an innovation economy emerging very strongly for the past 40 or 50 years and coming, I think, now to a level of real maturity as Australian cities become very important nodes in the Asia-Pacific system of cities. Now, the spatial form that knowledge, services, and innovation economy takes is a completely different one from the commodities economy. It relies on large-scale cities with big CBDs, generally speaking, where you can host a variety of sectors that can have an interaction with each other, particularly the professional services, law, accounting, finance, interacting with creative industries, culture, design-led industries, and their ability to interact with scientific, medicine, and other kinds of technology-led activities, and all of them being somehow yoked together by an urban environment that attracts talent and inspires people to interact with each other and to, as it were, co-create the economy together. So this new economy requires a transition away from the old modalities of the commodities economy, which will still thrive, but offering less employment, into having much more successful cities. And this is what I think has driven the growth of Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane, to some extent Perth, although Perth is much more of a headquarters city for the commodities economy. And it's also, of course, driving the growth of population in Canberra, and it's driving the rebirth of Adelaide and other cities as well. So that transition to a knowledge-based economy that requires cities and metropolitan areas to succeed is also accompanied by some other transitions. And one of those transitions is the transition from a sort of strong dominance on what we might call owner-occupied family homes, with a quarter-acre block in a suburb towards a mix of housing types and tenures that still include that traditional Australian format, but have many other formats as well, particularly including larger scale, denser developments that are linked to transit hubs, multi-family housing, if you want to call it that, or build to rent housing, or it includes many more compact kinds of townhouses being developed, or it includes housing as part of a mixed use development in a city centre where there may be housing for a certain number of stories in a building alongside other things. So you've got urban housing emerging in all its different varieties, as well as suburban housing continuing to play its role. Then you also have a shift in transport modalities. So you're trying to move away from simply, car-based journeys on roads or truck-based journeys on roads towards supporting more of an urban or metropolitan labour force in those new industries. That means public transport, and it means the integration of buses and trams and light rail and metro styles. But it also, of course, means increases in people who are walking and cycling and everything else. And you're seeing Australian cities doing all of that. It's just that they haven't been doing it continuously for 100 years. They've been doing it more or less for 20 or 30 years. And then there's another shift that goes on here, I think, Danny, which is a kind of a quality of life shift. And the way I would describe this very simply is that Australians are moving increasingly from primarily being preoccupied with the private amenities that they have, the garden, the pool, the access to the places within the fence that they own, towards the shared amenities. And Australians have always had a preference for shared amenities like beaches and waterfronts and the outback and wilderness. But they're also now moving to be much more interested in the shared amenity of the city, the cultural venues, the clubs, the restaurants, the waterfront walkways, the vibrant sort of districts, precincts, neighborhoods. This whole idea of shared amenity is part of that change as well. So sorry for the long answer, but what I'm really saying is the economic transition that's going on has very specific spatial consequences. And this is occasioning other transitions in housing, in transport, in lifestyle and quality of life, all of which have spatial transitions as well. So overseeing and co-creating and managing and inspiring this urban transition in Australia turns out to be really quite important.
So if cities, and particularly what you refer to as the downtown parts of cities, the central CBD districts, are finding a different place in our hearts. They're finding a different resonance with citizens of broader metropolitan areas and also suburbs and regions. And the way we use them is changing, but the way we feel about them is certainly changing.
Yes, and that's why we have to have leadership of that reconnection. So if you're switching from being a place that you have to go to because that's the only place you can do your work or your shopping, to being a place that you want to go to because that's where you're going to have the exciting interactions that create new kinds of value in your enterprise or give you a unique experience with your friends and your loved ones, or create a learning experience for your children, then the city and the urban spaces have to appeal to you in a different way. It's more of a love affair than a transaction.
That's a beautiful way to put it. I think you're spot on with that. Greg, I want to just dive quickly into the role of cities and our urban environment in responding to climate change, particularly. This is something you've looked at really, really closely, and particularly in Australia, while we have so much focus and policy focus on the renewable energy sector, the renewable energy opportunities, and that overall energy transition. When you look at Australia in the context of the world, what would your advice be? What would the top priority actions that Australia can take to address climate change through a city's lens?
Well, it's a very well put question, Danny. And I guess what I would say is that Australia has the opportunity to be a really significant world leader here. And the context is very clear. On the one hand, the climate emergency is already a real emergency in Australia. You only have to look at the flooding, the fires, the droughts, the challenges that produces in Australian cities already. If you just look at the last 10 years and you look at the crises that have emerged each year over those periods, Australia has every reason to become a leader in this space. Secondly, if you look at the inventiveness, the ingenuity, the tenacity, the determination of Australian people, you would expect them to be leaders, and they already are leaders, particularly, for example, in the alternative energy space. I always marvel when I'm in Australia at the conversation around how rapidly we can move to use converting solar into a complete, electric vehicle system, which I think is good. And all of the work that's happening at the level of the built environment in Australia to produce buildings that are amongst, the most environmentally and energy efficient in the world, the most resilient in the world. So you've every reason to do it. You've every ability to do it. The challenge is going to be to combine it with the things we were discussing in the last topic, which is all of these transitions. So generally speaking, if you want cities to become sustainable, resilient, and low carbon, those modal shifts that we described towards more compact and frugal use of land, so compact cities, connected cities in the sense that there are multimodal transport systems as well as digital connectivity, and then clean cities that you've cleansed, as it were, the utilities, the waste, the water, the sewage, the energy systems. You've got to bring together this clean, connected, and compact proposition as part of that transition at the economic level, at the housing level, the transport and the quality of life level. Now, the good news is I think this is exactly what Australia is thinking. And, I was lucky enough to read late last night when I received it, the new National Australian Urban Policy Statement. And I'm very grateful to Professor Barbara Norman, who sent it to me, who's been chairing the advisory board for that. And it seems to me that that's exactly what's being proposed here, that Australia will use the urgency of the crisis that it has and the ingenuity in which it's already a leader in energy systems and how they can be infused into transport and the built environment, alongside this transition to recognizing that Australia is an urban society. As they say in the report, 80% of Australians live in 20 cities. So if we focus on making those 20 cities clean, connected, and compact, we'll not only enable Australia to lead the decarbonisation process, but it will also accelerate and complete the transition to a knowledge and services and innovation economy. It will complete the transition to a mixed tenure housing market. It will complete the transition to multimodal transport systems, and it will complete a transition towards combining private amenities with public and shared amenities in a nice balance with people having a lot of choice. So what's not to like?
It's just such a positive and optimistic view on Australia, particularly from your international perspective, Greg. I could talk to you about this and listen to you speak about it for hours, but unfortunately we've got no more time left in our conversation. Thank you so much for being with the Australia in Focus podcast. You have just these most incredible insights, and I'm delighted to be able to share them with our listeners and our audience.
Danny, it's lovely to see you, and thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Australia in Focus with our international guest, Professor Greg Clark. You can connect with Greg on LinkedIn and dive deeper into his views and perspectives on his podcast, The Century of Cities and the DNA of Cities. You can also find out more about Greg at gregclark.com. And remember, you can find more episodes of the Australia in Focus podcast on Spotify, Apple, and YouTube, or at australiainfocus.com. Until next time, I'm your host, Danny Hunter, and this is Australia in Focus.